Okay, as promised, we're last session with a surprise guest, and I don't even know who it is, so this should be interesting. I'd like to welcome Chris Lennon. He is the President and CEO of Media Answers, and he is going to talk about microservices. So good things come in small packages, microservices for media. Take it away.
So thanks, Sarah. I detected a note of fear there with who the special guest might be. I don't know why you'd be afraid of that. But for those who have attended sessions of mine before at this conference, just show of hands, how many people are here just to see what the strange special guest might be? Okay. How many are just here for drink tickets? They're going to ask as many questions as possible. I feel like I'm in a position of power between you and the drinks. So we'll try to make it as entertaining and as painless as possible. So it may seem like we're going off on a tangent here, talking about microservices for media when the previous two speakers were focused on IMF. They're really not as dissimilar as you might think and not as unrelated as you might think. The overall theme of this session is workflows, and both of these technologies or both of these approaches really help a great deal in allowing for smooth automated workflows between systems. So keeping in mind that I am between the drinks and you, we'll keep going here. So let's just kind of take a look back first of all before we really even talk about microservices of how did we get here where we are today in terms of trying to link systems together and make systems work in an interoperable way. Yeah, and you could look at it a couple different ways. You could say it's been an evolution over the last 25 years, that things have gradually improved, or you might even look at it as a few different revolutions that have taken place in terms of media workflows and system interoperability. In the beginning, if we look back 25 years ago or so, the real state of the art was, ooh, I can download something. I could maybe have a watch folder and I could pull a file out of there. And that was pretty revolutionary a quarter century ago. Today, not so much. So we still do some of that. Have to admit that we haven't left that completely behind. But we've moved on to something called service-oriented architecture, and that was something that we really started talking about a lot, let's say maybe a decade ago, something like that. And it was a big step ahead beyond just file downloads, of course. This is where we were talking about systems talking to other systems using application program interfaces. Much more sophisticated than just dumping a file off and saying, hey, good luck with this. It was more real-time interaction between systems. So, that kind of seemed like the answer to everything, didn't it? It was big, monolithic, kind of like this. It seemed to help a great deal. However, those of you who have watched the 2001 and the sequel movies know the monolith isn't necessarily the be-all and end-all, and it isn't necessarily a great thing. There's a downside to monolithic things. And we ran into this when we started dealing with service-oriented architectures and these monolithic services. You'd ask it to do something, and it would come back and say, I'm sorry, I can't do that, Dave. And the reason was the fact that it was monolithic. And you were asking this huge thing to do something, and it was so complex that if you got something slightly wrong, it may not work quite the way you expect it to. So service-oriented architecture, while fantastic and a nice step beyond where we were with file downloading, really wasn't necessarily the be-all and end-all. So really what we were trying to get to with those steps was just trying to improve the efficiency with processing between various systems and really media workflows in general. That's really what we were trying to get at. And the problem, like I said, was that it was dealing with things at a macro level, at a very high level, one-size-fits-all type of approach. And as we all know, one-size-fits-all often means one-size-fits-none. And, in a lot of cases, that's kind of what we ended up with. So if you're going to go opposite from macro, we go to microservices. No, I must have got that wrong. Sorry. Microservices. And so, this is a buzzword, and always the danger with buzzwords out there is that if I were to ask everybody out there in the audience today what is a microservice, I bet I'd get as many different answers as there are people in this room. So for sake of argument, let's just accept that I'm right here. And that a microservice for the next 20 minutes or so, let's just agree that it's the smallest service or process that can be implemented that still, in and of itself, serves a viable, performant business requirement, okay? And if we just define it that way, and I'll give some examples to kind of outline what that really is, that'll help us to at least get to some common ground on what we're talking about. So why is it a good thing to go away from this big monolithic view that we've had up to this point in SOA down to microservices? There's a whole bunch of things that you get by breaking things into smaller bite-sized chunks. You can lower risk, very obviously, because you're only asking a service to do something very small and targeted, not asking it to do everything. Overhead gets lowered quite a bit, and this is why in a lot of cases when people are talking about cloud-based implementations, they kind of inherently move into the conversation of microservices. And it's because when you're dealing down at a micro level, you're lowering overhead, you're being able to deploy things much quicker, much more efficiently, much more resource efficiently than you could otherwise. From a vendor perspective, it lowers development times quite a bit. Again, they're developing small services that are very simple and very targeted. Of course, your deployment times go down, and theoretically, your costs should be lower as well. So this all sounds wonderful, right? Sign me up. I want to do microservices. As well as all those other things, it can improve performance. Efficiency was what we're talking about as a bottom line here. One of the things it really can help with is choice, where you're talking about having many little services all coming together to do a larger overall goal. You have more choice in how you get to that overall goal, because you can say, I want to use this service, and this service to get there. You don't need to just take one kind of overall approach to do that. The other thing that's great in terms of efficiency is reuse, being able to reuse these services for multiple different purposes. Again, because they're so granular and so targeted. So, macro versus micro, advantages, disadvantages. When you're talking about the macro view, it's very big, very capable, but also very limited in what you can do with it. Let's look at a example here. Under a traditional service-oriented architecture, think about it as a Swiss Army knife. Okay, the API can do many different things. In fact, think of it as the most hideous Swiss Army knife you could possibly imagine. And that's really what you're looking at when you're dealing with a lot of monolithic APIs that we deal with right now. You've got one thing that claims to do everything and do everything really well. If you've ever had a Swiss Army knife that's got a whole bunch of different things, yes, it does do a lot of things. It maybe doesn't do each of them particularly well, but it does a lot of different things under one umbrella. Whereas under a microservices model, you want a knife, we'll give you a knife. You want tweezers, we'll give you tweezers. You want a corkscrew, we'll give you a corkscrew. We don't give you one tool that claims to do all of these things plus 50 other things that you may never want to do. So hopefully that's a good analogy of why microservices are an attractive thing to us in terms of deploying software systems. So you might ask yourself, this is great. Microservices, fantastic, good approach. Why do we need SMPTE to come in and muck all this up? why can't we just go out and do this? Well, I'm here to tell you that SMPTE is not here to muck things up. They're actually here to help things out. And I think there's a definite role for standards when it comes to the whole area of microservices. We go back to the overall goal, really what we're trying to get to by using microservices is foster improved interoperability among systems that we use in the media ecosystem right now. We're trying to allow things to work across multiple platforms, across multiple vendors' platforms, and across their products. And so the whole key is, that's really why standards in general exist, right? They exist to allow us to work cross-platform, to work across vendors. And so if we want this microservices stuff to work across these various areas, you really need something that you all agree to at a base level, and that's standards. And kind of what you end up with, if you have distinct microservices out there right now, you might have a microservice that is a standards converter. Okay, that's great. It converts standards. Wonderful. You might have one that ingests content. You might have one that plays out content. You could even go to a much more granular level than all this. But without those various services talking together and coexisting, you don't really have a full solution. You just have these cool little services that do independent things, but it's difficult to fit them all together for a full solution. So again, why do we need standards? Microservices is nothing terribly new. It's reasonably new, but it's not brand new. We have many vendors out there in the media business right now who have been developing microservices for quite a while already. But they may have kind of taken their own approach to that, and certainly there hasn't been anything that really allows those to stitch together with solutions from other vendors. So this is not only attractive from a media company's perspective, but from the vendor's perspective, if we have some standards, we can allow the vendors to offer more complete solutions where they can partner up with other people who do things that they don't do. And from the user perspective, you can have much more customized solutions out there that are comprised of little bits and pieces from various different vendors. So I think there are advantages from the vendor side. There are advantages from the media company side as well here. So the best standardization efforts take input from several different sources, and the effort that we're just initiating within SMPTE around microservices is no exception to that rule. We've already taken some input from a few organizations whose names you will probably recognize here and are looking for others. The actual effort within SMPTE, it's interesting, came from a group that predated that by about a year called the MMEC. And you'll see a lot of the companies here are very familiar, a lot of the logos here. We're involved in this effort called the MMEC, the Media Microservices Edge Collaboration, which took things to a certain point and then kind of handed things off to SMPTE and said, we need to make this more of a global effort. So again, you'll see there are a lot of people on board here who you would hope would be in this type of thing. And already in the SMPTE drafting group, we have a lot of major players involved in this. But what kind of seems counterintuitive is that, okay, you're talking about something very agile, something very flexible, something very open when it comes to microservices, and then you're talking about SMPTE on the other side. And is that really agile? Does that really fit all this? Oh. Our standards vice president is telling me to calm down here. Have to have him come up.
Calm down. Look, we're not going to enter the age of crooked SOA again. We're going to make SMPTE agile again. SMPTE is going to be more agile than any other standards organization on this planet. We're going to make SMPTE the biggest thing We're going to do it bigly. We're going to do it betterly than anybody else on this planet. If IMF is the nouns, then I tell you the microservices are the verbs, and we're going to be doing some bigly sentences. So just listen to this man. Let's give him a round of applause because he's a great man. Thank you very much.
I had to give you the podium, Bruce, because obviously as Standards Vice President, you trump me as a lowly chair. Thank you, Bruce. We promised you. Now, are you not scared anymore, Sarah?
Terrified, but that was good.
But seriously, SMPTE does have an important role to play if this is all going to work together, and I think all the vendors out there seem to agree with that. And early on in the process, we've looked at what are some logical areas for microservices that might make sense for standardization. So kind of overall general infrastructure type of services makes sense. That's needed to be kind of agreed to by everybody. Issues that are unique to media microservices. So microservices is an approach that's been used in many other industries. But as we all know, we're special. We have our own needs here. And really, if you dig into it, we are special. We deal with files that are bigger than, sorry, Bruce, more bigly than a lot of other industries do. Also things like SLA performance, again, that's kind of common. Versioning certainly needed. Grouping them into jobs, again, microservices are nice, but they're only really valuable when you can group them together to perform an overall job. And so something like that could be something that makes sense to standardize. Prioritizing timing of those. How do you deal with errors and exception handling? How do you represent them? These are all potential things. And it's early days right now where we're working on what do we really need to standardize within SMPTE. And these are just some examples of some things that we've kind of looked at that we think probably make sense for SMPTE to work on in order to foster, again, true interoperability. If we think about this, the SMPTE approach as the structure of the earth or the layers of the earth, it's maybe not so crazy to look at it that way. At the core of everything that we deal with, we have standards. So that's the type of stuff I was just talking about on the previous slides, things that we all need to agree upon for this to all work. And so that's kind of the core. And that's the hot bubbling stuff is what we're going to work on within SMPTE. Then you kind of have a next layer, and that can still probably be done under the SMPTE standards area, but maybe it's more recommended practices, informational stuff of, okay, what is a microservice? Things that we have to kind of agree on fundamentally, architecturally, might belong in something more like recommended practices. Okay, so we're still kind of within the SMPTE standards realm that we all know and love. But now let's move out of that. As we move up to the mantle of the earth, we're talking about bringing the microservices in from the outside and reviewing them, approving them, that sort of thing, and having a suite of microservices that are approved that kind of fit into this overall ecosystem. And that's a little bit outside of what SMPTE is normally used to. And how do we kind of get to that? What we've been talking about is kind of open source meets SMPTE. Let's have an open way for vendors or others who are out there in the media business who've developed microservices to submit them to us and say, here, I've already developed all of these. Either approve these or tell me what needs to be done to approve them and fit them into kind of your overall SMPTE microservices approved set. I think that's, we've kind of talked about that internally as that being a better approach than SMPTE going off and saying, okay, all of you who have developed microservices, throw all those out. We're going to create some new things and they're going to be bigger and better than what you've done. kind of a bad idea. If I was a vendor, I don't think I'd react to that very well. So we're going to try to kind of reverse that and say, if you've got microservices, bring them in, and we'll try to make those fit into what we've already got here. Again, kind of a departure for SMPTE, and it is truly making SMPTE agile again. Speaking of agility, so this is kind of another way to look at it, is we would have kind of the foundational information in a standard, RP, EG, those types of documents, maybe some decomposition in another area, and then have little documents that maybe deal with specific microservices or just the services themselves. We'll see how we end up doing that. So just to wrap this up, the whole microservices approach is something that is very well proven in other industries. Whether you know it or not, you use them all the time. It's about time that we start using these and applying them to media, because there are huge efficiencies to be gained. And as more and more media companies look to move things into the cloud, again, I hate to use another buzzword up here, but the cloud really implies if you're going to use it to its full benefit, you really want to take a microservices approach to that. And of course, I'm at a SMPTE conference, so standardization absolutely has a role here. And I think we can't really get to where we need to get as a business in terms of truly interoperable microservices and have a wonderful suite of services that we can pick and choose from, unless we have a certain amount that we all agree to in terms of a base level of standardization. And hopefully you were able to kind of see here today that SMPTE is very open to taking some new, innovative, agile approaches to make all this work and make this something that we can develop pretty rapidly and kind of bring to the business in a time-critical way. So with about 2 minutes left, that's all I have, and we have time for perhaps a question or two.
Yes, time for questions. Have a ticket.
So for most of people, what microservice means, the web services, means the RESTful API, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, and as what we know, we already have some standard for the RESTful API, right? So are we going to, define some SMPTE rules for the architecture only, or?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah, it does in a lot of cases imply RESTful APIs, and we've looked at within SMPTE, where possible, we want to reference what other people have defined already and not reinvent. And so if there are areas here that have been well defined in other standards development organizations, we want to point to those and perhaps improve upon them where necessary. But generally, we're trying to invent as little as possible here, and just have a very kind of thin layer of base standards that are kind of referenced here. So it's a good question, but yeah, if there are things that we should be pointing to in terms of that, we're completely open to that. Bruce?
Yeah, I thought I'd just help you out with the answer there a little bit and tie in the microservices to Raymond's OPL presentation. Because if you think of the OPL as like a noun, it's I want to do that OPL. You need a number of verbs to actually apply that OPL. I need to apply that to a ProRes. I need to apply that to this group of assets. I need to add this OPL to that OPL to give me a mega OPL. I see those verbs not as to be more like microservices, that you would define a microservices way of taking OPLs and put them together to derive new results. Because then you have a SMPTE noun, which is the OPL standard, and then specific instances of a class of microservices that would be OPL processing microservices that, if you like, would either be direct instances that a coder could implement, or they'd be templates that people could derive from to generate more practical and maybe more fully featured OPL processing. The idea is to try and create a register of all of these verbs that can be applied to the sorts of nouns that you need within a media facility, just to try and improve interoperability, because at the moment, vendor A's ingest an MPEG-4 API, and vendor B's ingest an MPEG-4 API. You can't even exchange the metadata parameters because they're all just completely random nowadays. So we have literally no interoperability at all today. But a bit of verb standardization might help. Won't do any harm. We probably won't make things worse. Maybe.
And I would say if you're interested in pointing us in the right direction on a lot of this stuff, please, please, please join our drafting group. We'd love to have you join our group and help to guide us on this. It's early days and we're very open to being guided. It's the 34CS drafting group on overall architecture of media microservices. So I'm the chair of that. Please join it. If you have any questions about how to join it, please come and see me. I'd be happy to point you in the right direction. So with that, I think we're done.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please tap the like button and also subscribe to our channel to receive notifications when we add new content. For more information about us, please visit SMPTE.org. We'll see you next time.